Great. I'm going to go ahead and start. It is a little after 3 now. So welcome. My name is Kristina Lang, and I am from Georgia State University's Dunwoody Campus Library. And today we're going to talk a little bit about contemplative practices for instruction librarians. And some of the topics that we'll cover are a little background on this topic, as well as self-care for instruction librarians and how this affects personal and professional growth, as well as some contemplative pedagogy practices that can be used in library instruction and de-stress programming for students. Now we're going to begin with a contemplative practice of a breathing exercise. And I just want everyone to know, before we get started with this, I would like you, if you feel comfortable, please join with me in this exercise. Now, please note, if you don't feel comfortable with breathing exercises or meditation, just find a comfortable seat and wait a moment, and we will catch up with you in a minute. And what we'll be doing is looking at a shape on screen that will help us time our breaths. And as you do this, if you're participating, try to breathe in from your stomach, the bottom of your abdomen, because this will help you to use your full lung capacity, and then exhale fully when you exhale. And we're going to try to do this for about 4 times. So we'll start with this one. Inhale after the pause. Pause, hold that breath, and exhale. And pause, and inhale. Hold the breath and pause, and exhale. And pause, inhale. Hold the breath and pause, exhale. And one last time, pause, inhale. Hold the breath, exhale. Thank you very much for joining me with that. That's just an example of the topic for today, contemplative practices. So a little background on this topic. We might think of mindfulness in the United States as a relatively recent phenomenon. And while we might see references to mindfulness practice everywhere lately, it can be helpful to explore why, and why is this such a big part of self-care and wellness now? Well, according to Jon Kabat-Zinn, author of Wherever You Go, There You Are, mindfulness practices in the U.S. can be traced back to 19th century American transcendentalism and an interest in Eastern philosophies. This interest was revived with the Beat movement in the 1950s and the subsequent counterculture of the 1960s. While Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh taught in the U.S. in the 1960s, Daniel Goleman, who later wrote Emotional Intelligence, researched mindfulness and stress, traveled to India, and in 1979, Jon Kabat-Zinn cited Goleman's research and developed mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR, and started the MBSR Clinic, whose establishment is described as a watershed moment for mindfulness in the Western world. Much of what we see in MBSR consists of many things that we see promoted as basic self-care these days, and this makes sense as it is a precursor to the more intense mindfulness-based therapies that were developed as treatment for specific mental health diagnoses. MBSR has been used to train teachers to be more mindful and to prepare those same teachers to teach mindfulness to their pupils. This is probably why much of this is at least vaguely familiar to us in the context of recommended healthy living. Now, there are some later therapies incorporating mindfulness, and they're a result of the rise of behaviorism in the first scientifically based psychological approaches. These therapies are interesting to me as a teacher because of their emphasis on teaching skills. In this case, emotional literacy skills that the learner can practice and use to enrich their life. And as an instruction librarian, my job is to teach students information literacy skills to help them enrich their lives through their schoolwork and research. So these emotional skills that I mentioned are usually coping skills and involve finding alternatives to what is called, quote, maladaptive coping skills. Those are techniques that learners have relied on to get through life this far, but are not the best. Because they've been able to use them with at least some success, they can be hard to unlearn. Does this remind anyone of some of the stubborn ideas and methods students might bring with them into our instruction classrooms and research? Maybe they've come in with research skills that don't serve them as well as they could. And we persevere trying to help them learn and utilize better skills to serve them better as students and researchers. Now, some of the sources that I am drawing on and that really helped me explore this topic are Contemplative Practices in Higher Education by Barbazat and Bush. It talks about contemplative practices for higher ed in general. Next, there are two more books that discuss methods for applying mindfulness techniques specifically for librarians. And these are The Mindful Librarian by Moniz and others, as well as Becoming a Reflective Librarian and Teacher by Michelle Reel. Barbazat and Bush's book on contemplative practice in higher ed addressed the diverse background of many of these practices, which can be found in Buddhism, Christian monasticism, and Sufism. And this isn't an exhaustive list. There are lots of traditions that have elements of contemplative practice in them. Another excellent resource, if you're interested in contemplative pedagogy and practices, is the Contemplative Pedagogy Interest Group of the American Library Association. And I will have a link at the end of this guide where I'll put up resources if you're interested in finding out more about this. Another one that is another source of information on this topic is really excellent comes from the Center for the Contemplative Mind in Society at contemplativemind.org. One of their great resources is the Tree of Contemplative Practices that's shown here. You can see that there are different roots and branches of this tree that contain many different types of contemplative practices, and some of the categories are communion and connection, awareness, stillness, generative, creative, active, relational, movement, and ritual, cyclical. And I will be talking about some of my favorite ones and ones that I'm interested in exploring and learning more about. And I hope you find some favorites too. So how this relates to instruction for librarians is by being more mindful librarians and teachers, we help our students by extension, but we don't have to stop there. Contemplative pedagogy, described as the integration of meditative practices into higher education by Rhett McDaniel, who also says that it fosters the development of the whole person, increasing capacities such as creativity, empathy, compassion, interpersonal skills, and self-awareness. And as I'm exploring this, I I'm learning that as we cultivate our own mindfulness practice, we can look to this tree of meditative practices and see a lot of overlap between the methods utilized historically through different philosophies and religions and the mindfulness therapies that have been so helpful. Another way that this applies to librarians is that we all are aware that anxiety is common for so many people. But as a new librarian, I have been more aware of how anxiety-provoking teaching can be. Public speaking is often said to be one of the most common fears anyway. And as a librarian, our position can bring together a perfect storm of stress-provoking ingredients. Emotional labor is an essential part of our profession as we work with the public, and it makes emotion regulation a job requirement. The imposter phenomenon, aka imposter syndrome, can go in hand with this, and it can really get to us when we start comparing ourselves to others in an unhealthy way. Part of this is a running dialogue called the inner critic. You may recognize this as an inner voice that may not be very positive. It may cause us to beat ourselves up when we make a mistake. And this is basically an example of what the therapies call negative self-talk. And it can really get to us when we start letting perfectionism take over. Along the same lines, rumination can be a big one for us because as teachers, we're prone to intellectualize things. And we try to think ourselves out of situations and things that bother us. And this can really backfire because we're dealing with what the therapies call cognitive distortions or ways of looking at reality inaccurately. And when we get into the cycle, we can't think our way out of trouble. So what do we do for this? Well, there are different methods. For one type of meditation, for example, is loving kindness meditation or metta meditation. It's a way to practice compassion for ourselves as well as for others. And that's really important that it starts with self-compassion first and gives us permission to be compassionate for ourselves in the same way that we would be with a friend or someone that we cared about, and then think of other people and have that same compassion for them as well. It is really helpful to start with yourself to help with being more empathetic. And it helps with things like imposter syndrome to target problems like envy and bitterness. Another contemplative practice is journaling. This is one that is very helpful for me personally, and using prompts is a great way to reflect on your teaching and to track growth. Reflective writing and journaling is another practice that can be incorporated into assignments in your classroom as well. Some of the methods are getting students to reflect on their experience with an activity and lead to deeper learning. And you can use different methods like prose writing as well as storyboards. Visualizing things in these different ways can give us different ways of looking at them. There's also contemplative reading. One example of this is Lectio Divina. It's a monastic practice of reading the Bible in a contemplative way, and teachers now use this in a more secular way to look at other texts. So something similar that I've observed in my colleagues and tried in some of my classes is trying having students interact with physical copies of books or articles as a way to prepare them for looking at the different parts and components of these digital components of like ebooks and articles. since that might be the most common way that they're used to reading and taking in this information. If we hand them, say, a book and have them look at the different parts and kind of break things down, and figure out how to see the table of contents, the index, where they might find different pieces of information. It's going to be very different from reading an ebook or reading an online article. We can also give them papers and let them interact with that, marking things up, highlighting things, using Post-it and other props in order to just interact with things and also add a tactile feel to this. And using the different senses is an important part of contemplative practices. One example of a contemplative practice is using things like prayer beads or other things that you would hold in your hand. And so you can kind of get an idea of how this could be important. Another contemplative practice is yoga. Barbizet and Bush say that yoga is different from stretching or other kinds of fitness because it explicitly connects the movement of the body and the fluctuations of the mind to the rhythm of the breath. Connecting the mind, body, and breath helps us to direct attention inward to the cultivation of awareness. Yoga promotes flexibility and strength of body and mind, cultivates balance and calms the mind. It alleviates stress and creates a welcome feeling of wholeness and deep relaxation. And it clears the mind, leaving openness to new and creative ideas. And that's something that we would like to inspire in our students, isn't it? You know, this openness and creativity. So part of the way that I have incorporated this into programming and am exploring introducing into a classroom setting is making these calm down kits. Now, outside of the library classroom, I've organized yoga classes during exam weeks as part of our library's de-stress programming. And in between our yoga classes, I have offered the same space as a meditation room where students can take a break in a quiet place. One part of one of the therapies that I studied called dialectical behavioral therapy involves self-soothing, which is a way to use the 5 senses to promote calm. By providing some ingredients that students can use to create their own self-soothing or calm down kit, we can use things like polished stones, squishy and fidget toys. We can appeal to that tactile sense. Also, some things that we can add are aromatherapy diffusers and oils, hard candy, dimmed natural lighting, and soothing music. So this can appeal to the other senses as well. Practicing yoga can be helpful to you and your students. And this, like with the other practices that we go over today, other contemplative practices, what you learn from your own personal experience can help guide you on how you incorporate this into your own pedagogy. One example for me is my experience with yin yoga was something that I started to draw on when I first started out as an instruction librarian. Now, yin yoga practice is not very active, but it is a challenge. It focuses on stretching the fascia or connective tissue, and while it is never supposed to be painful, it can be challenging and uncomfortable. And during this whole process of holding these stretching poses for longer than you would with regular yoga, breath becomes really important here as we are encouraged to breathe through our discomfort, but still not do anything painful. And this is something that I thought of in my first days as an instruction librarian when I had pre-class jitters before a class. And I started framing my mental discomfort like the physical discomfort of those long stretches in yoga where I was just like, I just need to breathe through this. And this really, really was helpful. I really benefited by paying attention to my breathing And it didn't have to be a big guided thing like we did at the beginning of the class. Um, it can be something simple where nobody else can see what you're doing. If you're like about to walk into the classroom or you're behind the podium or something like that, getting ready for the class to start. This is something that can be quite simple or elaborate as you need it to be. And here are some examples of shapes online. These are animated GIFs that I found in my presentation software Canva. And I used another one at the beginning of the class with the breathing exercise that we practiced. We used the 4-7-8 type breathing where you're timing it. You can do this at different intervals. The strict one is 4-7-8, but really the main thing is making sure that you're breathing evenly. Another example is box breathing, and just doing like a Google search for box breathing and seeing the images crop up, you can see a lot of these types of things. So it's something really easy to see what's out there and see what would be available for you to use as a visual if you want to do that. Like at the beginning of the class, after I decided to start taking this practice that I was doing on my own and incorporate into classes, I did something similar to what we did at the beginning of the class. And even though this practice had helped me so much, I was very nervous about how the students would react. But they were great. I've always been sure to make sure to let them know that this is optional. And another lesson that I learned from yoga was to frame it in a way as not to make anyone feel left behind. If anyone wanted to opt out, I just let them know that the goal was for them to take a moment to relax and that we would catch up to them in a minute, and they had their option. This is similar to a yoga teacher that I had that in between our yin yoga postures, we would go to Shavasana or the corpse pose where you're laying flat on your back. And so we would always end up there. We would kind of cycle to that. And the way that she put it to us was that if at any point you feel like you need to get out of this pose or posture, just go ahead and get into Shavasana and we'll catch up with you. And I feel like that's very inclusive because it makes people feel like they're ahead rather than behind. And, it is not our intention to make our students feel uncomfortable or be in any pain during class or practicing any skill. And one thing to be mindful of is that meditation and breathing exercises might not work for everybody. Some people can have panic attacks. Sometimes this can bring up a lot of emotions, and some of these emotions might not be something that students want to deal with, especially in class in front of other people. So that's one thing that I would like to point out that is good to keep in mind. Even if you have a really positive experience with it, that won't be everybody's experience. And so giving people excuses to find other ways to relax, like if you're going to do that, giving them permission to stretch their legs or letting them know where the water fountain is if they need to take a break and go to get a drink of water during the exercise, gives them permission to get out of the room if they have a negative reaction to this or feel uncomfortable. And so that's a tip that I would have regarding this. Also, outside of the library classroom, the yoga classes that I was speaking of, where we had the same space as the meditation space. This kind of started out with just the meditation space, and this book on the screen here on the right, Jen Carson's book and websites, started from me watching one of her webinars and getting more interested in her work with yoga in the library. And it really, it gave me the courage to ask if this would be a possibility at my library. And I was directed to ask for some help from our kinesiology department. And they were awesome. They referred me to our recreation department, who let me borrow mats for our meditation and yoga, and also recommended a kinesiology professor who volunteered as a teacher for a couple of our classes. And next, I reached out to the community and found a yoga studio that was happy to provide a volunteer teacher. And ultimately, after that, I was able to secure a grant to cover the cost of the teacher and sort of pay back this teacher who had volunteered and helped for free. In the next classes that they taught, they were compensated for. And also, as part of that grant, I was able to get restorative yoga prompts. So this didn't all happen at once. Some of this, I had no idea that these types of things would be possible and that it would grow into this, but I was very fortunate and happily surprised. Also, some things that we can look at in and out of the classroom are labyrinths. And the one on the right is a walkable canvas labyrinth. It's quite large and can fit different sizes of rooms. You might, when you look at different labyrinths too, you might see stone labyrinths that people have in designated spaces outside, and those are really great too. I personally have walked a canvas labyrinth, and it was a really cool and interesting thing, very calming. And these are available for rentals. So it's possible to get one of these without having to spend a lot of money on it. But if you are just dipping your feet in this and figuring out how you would like to use a labyrinth and you don't have the budget for renting one, there are other possibilities. The finger labyrinth on the left of the screen is a wooden version, but I've also seen stone versions and ceramic ones. And so that's a tactile way of working with a labyrinth. That is something that could be fit into a calm down kit for in-library use. And one that is pretty much free is this copyright-free labyrinth in the middle. It's labyrinth sheets that are available for printing. And you can use these along with meditative coloring sheets during de-stress events or weeks. So I'd like to end this on Barbara Zaden-Bush's quote on practicing contemplative practices yourself. They say, feeling twinges of guilt or self-indulgence when you're beginning a practice is common. For many of us, time is precious, and we face many demands from family, friends, and work. In those moments when you question your priorities, remember that contemplative practices are not distractions or diversions from the daily activities, but opportunities to get in touch with what is deeply meaningful. Feeling twinges of guilt or self-indulgence when you're beginning a practice is common. For many of us, time is precious, and when we face many demands from family, friends, and work. In those moments, when you question your priorities, remember that contemplative practices are not distractions or diversions from daily practices. Cluttered schedules not only constrict time we have, but also manipulate our understanding of value and worth. It is crucial to remember the simple value and beauty of life as it is, not as it is used. The simple awareness cultivated by contemplative practices can bring us back in touch with this beauty, enriching our interactions with others. So part of the takeaways that they say in this chapter is just making time for contemplative practices and try to practice what you preach before you introduce something into the classroom. realize that if it has value for the classroom, that you should also be able to find the value in it for yourself. And here's my contact information and a link to a research guide that I made to accompany this presentation. And I am going to go ahead and close the presentation and open up for questions. And I see, yeah, someone asked about the calm down kit idea. Those are fun. It's fun to see how people interact with them differently. Yeah. Does anybody have any questions? I haven't talked about every single contemplative practice. I can put up the tree of contemplative practices if anybody would like to see that, or if you would like the link to the guide, just let me know. And also if you have any other questions. I have a question for the moderators. Is there anything, am I able to see all the Q&As and everything? Are there any questions coming in?
Hi, yeah, this is Allison. I don't see any right now, just a lot of thanks and nothing in the Q&A at the moment.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So yeah, I guess if we don't have any more questions, we can wrap up. But this was really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I've sort of had an interest recently in meditation and yoga, and it's sort of interesting, the idea of incorporating it into library instruction as something beneficial for the students.
Thank you. Yeah, it's something that's been fascinating me as I've explored it more and more.
Hey, I guess if we have no further questions, we can go ahead and close out. I know they're recording this, so the recordings will be available later. If any last minute comments or questions? I think we're good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.